You're listening to Sustainably Geeky, the podcast for everyday environmentalists.
Hi, and welcome to Sustainably Geeky, episode 23. I'm Jennifer, and tonight I'm joined by Chris.
Hello.
And Dr. John Nielsen-Gammon, who is the Texas State Climatologist. So we're going to be obviously talking about climate today, and he specializes in extreme weather. We'll be talking a lot about that. Dr. Nielsen-Gammon grew up in Northern California and went to school at MIT, received a PhD in 1990, and a year later joined the faculty at Texas A&M, where he's now Regents Professor of Atmospheric Sciences. He was designated Texas State Climatologist by then Governor George W. Bush in 2000. And his research started out in weather, but expanded to climate and is now a mashup of the two, since he spends a lot of his time working on climate change effects on extreme weather. So he relies on observation, statistical analysis, and computer simulations, all working towards physical understanding. Sounds like you're a busy man.
Somebody.
So, can you, for the benefit of our listeners, talk about, kind of how the work that you do maybe applies to their lives and residents of the state, and I guess just kind of expand on what it is that the state climatologist does.
Yeah, there's no real fixed job description per se. Just about every state in the country has a state climatologist. It used to be someone in the Weather Service that was overseeing the collection of climate data, and then back in 1973, the Weather Service decided that climate really wasn't its thing, and so they got out of the climate services business, and a lot of states picked up the slack. State climatologists are mostly like land grant institutions, or they're either atmospheric scientists or geographers, and what we do varies quite a bit. I mainly focus on doing applied climate research, which is research on stuff that actually affects people and can help with decision making or avoiding climate hazards. I do a lot of press interviews. We released our first set of climate projections last month. I'm working on projects for monitoring drought and assessing changes in frequency of extreme rainfall, in addition to being a faculty member at Texas A&M.
Yeah, I was going to ask, are you also teaching? Because it sounds like that's a full-time job in itself.
Yeah, we're mostly a research department, so our normal teaching load is one course a semester. And I do that 2 courses in one semester and 0 in the other, so I can focus on outreach during the other semester. And I also have about 6 graduate students that I'm supervising and mentoring as well.
Oh, okay. So very busy man, and you've been doing this a while, so you know your stuff, you know Texas weather, and I know that you've seen a lot of things change. Can you kind of, for the benefit of folks who maybe aren't as familiar or don't quite understand, explain what is climate change and how does it differ from weather? Because they are 2 distinct things, but I think a lot of times people think they're interchangeable.
Well, to some extent they are. My simple definition of climate is it's the statistics of the weather. So if you have a day with a high temperature of 105, that's weather. If 105 actually set the record for the day, then that's climate as well. We think of climate as often being just the average conditions, but it actually represents the average conditions and the extremes and basically the whole range of possibilities. So you can't really, a single weather observation doesn't tell you anything about the climate unless you put it in the context of the weather conditions that have happened over a period of several decades. And, until relatively recently, scientifically, we treated the climate as something where the more records we get, the more precisely we know what the climate is. But then scientists realized that the climate was changing and changing at a pace which was rather unusual, to say the least, compared to past climate changes. And so when we talk about climate change these days, we're really talking about the change that's going on right now associated with the warming of global temperatures and all the things that go along with that.
Yeah. So someone saying, it's cold, it was cold this winter, or it snowed, there obviously climate change isn't real. That's where you draw the distinction of, no, that was weather. It was cold in the winter because it's winter, but the average temperature or the average, weather patterns are shifting year to year, even if it's a little bit at a time, kind of.
Yeah, if you're talking about climate change, then you're looking for trends in the weather, and of course scientifically you're looking at what's causing those trends. There's not much variation from year to year in the average global temperature. I think this year's temperature was maybe something like 5/100ths of a degree different from the previous year's global temperature, something like that. But as you get down to smaller and smaller scales, the variability goes up tremendously. So that if you took at the average conditions where you're living last year, that could be different by 2 or 3 degrees compared to what happened the previous year, and it's almost just as likely to be up than down. So you have to look at a longer period of time to actually tell whether there's a trend going on.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned the global temperature, and we hear a lot about this 2 degrees. We're 2 degrees away from basically the point of no return. Can you speak to that? I guess, what is the significance of that, shift, whether it's 2 degrees or you think it's a different, variation? What will that signify, or what will that kind of trigger if we get to that point?
Yeah, well, the way I think about it, 2 degrees was specified as a target basically by the international community, because basically they needed a target. You can't achieve a goal for limiting climate change unless you specify what that goal is. And 2 degrees makes sense for a lot of reasons. It's probably about as hot as it got during the last interglacial period before we had the most recent ice age. So it's not something that the planet hasn't experienced fairly recently being 120,000 years ago.
Scientifically.
But no matter what threshold you pick, the impacts in terms of the impacts to society, impacts to the natural environment, and all of that are going to be smaller if you stay below that level than if you exceed it. A few years back, people started thinking that, well, maybe 2 degrees actually gives us impacts that we really don't want. We want to avoid it. And so the international community with the Paris Accord said, well, okay, we're gonna keep things under 2 degrees, but we're going to really try hard to keep it under 1.5 degrees. And then that caused as part of that, they turned to the scientists and said, we'd really like to keep it under 1.5 degrees. What difference would that make? And how can we go about doing that? And the difference it makes is, well, basically everything has less harmful effects. There's smaller impacts from climate change. And as far as how you do it, the answer was, it's probably not going to happen. It's really difficult to keep things under 1.5 degrees. But don't be dismayed by our likely failure to reach that target, because every little bit we do to reduce climate change reduces the impacts, and the impacts go up exponentially as temperatures go up. So holding temperatures down a little bit has a really big beneficial impact. Holding down a bit more helps a lot. Holding down a bit more helps even more, but not so big a change. That last bit from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees is the least consequential half-degree change in that whole scale.
Interesting. And just for the benefit of our listeners, when we're talking degrees, we're talking in Celsius, not Fahrenheit, correct?
Yeah, we're talking.
So that's why.
Yes, and we're talking about global average temperatures. So the average change in degrees Fahrenheit on land where people live is going to be something like 2 to 2.5 times the global Celsius temperature change.
Right. Yeah.
So 1.5 degrees Celsius is around 3 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit where people live in like North America and Europe.
Yeah, I know a lot of times people hear 2 degrees, and if you're in the Fahrenheit mindset, you think, oh, that's not much, but we have to remember Celsius jumps a little bit more than the Fahrenheit. So
yeah, one day it starts making seeming like a lot bigger changes. We talk about the number of days where we exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the summertime. That's a pretty significant threshold. People start thinking, damn, it's really hot when it's 100 degrees. And basically every degree temperature is warm during the summertime. A typical place in Texas will have about twice as many days over 100 degrees as it used to. So we're actually talking about something on the order of a quadrupling of 100-degree days, even if global temperatures stay at 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Chris is from Canada, and she just is boggled by the thought of that much heat.
I went down, I visited you guys in August, it's almost 3 years ago, and it was, I don't know what it is in Fahrenheit, it was 38 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
Congratulations. Yeah, that's about 90 Fahrenheit.
So, no, thank you. So if you're quadrupling the amount, I'm never coming down. I'm sorry. I'm not coming. You're going to have to come up and visit me.
Conversely, I visited Chris in August of last year, and it was delightful up there. Yeah, and they were complaining about the heat, and I was like, oh, this is kind of nice. 80-something degrees.
Yeah, if you try visiting in the wintertime, you get a completely different experience, of course.
Yeah.
And our extreme cold temperatures are getting warmer faster than our extreme hot temperatures, which has its own consequences for the natural environment, lengthens the growing season, and so forth. What I tell people as far as their actual experience of climate change is we'll know that climate change is a big deal in people's daily lives when people stop moving from the northern United States to the southern United States when they retire and instead move in the other direction.
Yeah.
So we're not seeing that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, you're kind of touching on some things that you guys talked about in a study you recently completed, assessment of historic and future trends of extreme weather in Texas, 1900 to 2036. So do you want to talk a little bit about that study? Is that the most recent publication your office has put out?
Yeah, sure. It's actually our first and only official climate projections.
Okay.
There's been a couple of attempts at sort of a comprehensive assessment of climate change for Texas that were organized by Jürgen Schmatt, Jerry North, and Judy Clarkson. The second book on that was released in 2010 or thereabouts, and I wrote one of the chapters covering the observations. And along came this organization called Texas 2036, which is basically trying to get Texas to focus on long-term planning, with the time horizon being the year 2036 being the bicentennial of Texas's independence. We're of course privileged to be a state that was actually independent at one time. And so they wanted to know what's going to happen to extreme weather in the next couple decades. But they wanted to know about it from an observed perspective because a lot of people in Texas don't really trust the whole climate change thing. They don't trust climate models and so forth. So what I set about doing was getting the observations together and saying, okay, here's what the trends are in the observations. And 2 decades from now, there's not going to be much of a change in the super tanker that's climate. We're going to continue warming no matter what we do to carbon dioxide emissions over just a couple decades. So you can pretty well extrapolate trends and say what's going to be happening over the next couple decades. I really only use climate models to figure out what time horizon for the trends to focus on. Like over the past 40 years, Texas temperature has been warming at slightly faster rate than global temperatures, and that is expected to continue according to climate models. So I use that as a starting point.
And what I found interesting was you mentioned that the warmer seasons aren't necessarily getting warmer on average, but the colder seasons are. And I've definitely noticed that, living in Texas for 20 years, but I also feel like every summer is just hotter and hotter. I don't know if that's just a product of, like you said, there's more over 100 days, or it's just the heat is just so oppressive that it just seems to get worse and worse. But that's an interesting trend that only one seems to be shifting at this point.
That's true for the extremes. If you just look at, say, average temperatures, it's pretty much gone up by 1.5 or 2 degrees Fahrenheit compared to the 20th century average in summer and winter. The extremes are doing a little bit different thing because, like in the wintertime, our super cold weather comes from, no offense, from Canada, and the Arctic is warming at a rate faster than the rest of the planet, and so we're basically losing that source of extreme cold air. So when we get a super blast of cold air from the north, it's not as cold as it used to be. Our warm summer temperatures and humidity, which you're familiar with, comes from the tropical oceans. Tropical oceans are warming fairly slowly, but the fact that you get the higher temperatures and higher humidity at the same time makes it feel like a pretty big temperature change, because it does become uncomfortable pretty quickly.
Okay, so I'm not crazy completely.
Not in this respect, anyway, no.
Thank you for that validation. Chris, did you have anything you want to jump in with?
I was interested when you said that people in Texas don't really believe the climate change stuff. I mean, we're not free of that up here either, but why do you think that is, specific to Texas?
Of course, climate change has been politicized quite a bit, and so it becomes sort of an identity politics issue. And Texas is predominantly Republican state, so that's a large part of it. Another part of it is Texas's economy is founded for the past 100 years basically on oil and gas as a large component of that, and so there's a lot of recognition of the value of oil and gas development in the economy of Texas, and consequently a negative view on things that would harm that aspect of the economy. I think those two factors combined tend to do that, although surveys of the general public tend to have Texas's point of view on climate change be similar to what it is nationally. But as you get toward the political leaders, things become a lot more polarized.
Is that frustrating for you as a scientist?
It is frustrating that it's difficult for people in state agencies to actually use the words climate change, because that can
It's
get
like
people...
a dirty word in some circles.
Yeah. With our update for disaster management plans that we sent to FEMA last year, rather than talking about climate change, we talked about future weather, which was perfectly acceptable to consider. And I think really there's a difference between what politicians have to say in public and what they believe in private. I think that people are a lot closer together once they get down to the nitty-gritty of it and close the doors and have frank discussions.
Yeah, it's also interesting. I live near Fort Hood, and Fort Hood embraced a few years ago. Of course, this was under a different administration, but they embraced going zero energy, zero waste, based largely on a study done by the DoD that found that climate change is a threat multiplier, and it directly affects their ability to do their job and defend the country. So they're taking it pretty seriously, and to that end, they've invested in solar and wind and shifting their entire infrastructure to that, one to go cleaner, but also to get off on their own grid. So there are certain aspects of the government, like you said, that seem to be taking this seriously and taking steps, and then there's kind of a disconnect in other areas, and I don't know why this is politicized. I really don't understand. It's science, and it's health, and it makes economical sense. It boggles my mind, and I'm sure you've
there's a lot of urban rural divide and political issues in Texas and climate change as well. Houston, Austin, El Paso, San Antonio have all developed climate change action plans. But as you get toward more rural communities, there's a greater value for independence. And so things that require collective action like climate change don't get through the door as easily.
That's a good point. Yeah. Although, Texas is very well suited for both solar and wind power because it's very windy and very sunny and hot here.
We generate a lot. We generate more wind power here than any other state. So
yeah,
we have taken advantage of that. It wasn't sold as a climate change action, but as a economic opportunity.
Yeah. Do you do you foresee I guess folks embracing more of the economic benefits of this, both in Texas and just states or even nationwide? In the future, do you see that being more of a, I guess, a push for folks than the other aspects, the environmental stuff and the health and the other things that can come out of climate change? Or
yeah, I think the economics is key. I'm fairly pessimistic about people willingly sacrificing a portion of their income to help the global climate do a lot better in 50 years. That's a really hard sell once it comes down to real money. But once we get the technology to the point where it's easier and cheaper to use energy sources that don't emit carbon dioxide and so forth, or change the economics of it so that carbon dioxide emissions aren't an externality, as the economists call it, then people don't have to do the right thing because it's the right thing. They do the right thing because they're always trying to make their dollars go farther.
Yeah. I guess that's something I always struggle with. It's like I just want people to do it because it's the right thing, and then I have to realize sometimes you've got to have other motivators, and luckily the economics is on our side too, so that helps.
Yeah, it's getting there. The problem with climate change, the problem is that it requires broad action across all of society. It's something where the benefits are way down the road for the most part. It's something where people can't really see it happening, and people tend to agree that climate change is a big issue. But if you try to rank it compared to other issues, there are always going to be several things that are higher on the list. Obviously, COVID-19 is pretty darn high on everybody's list right now.
Right.
Yeah.
To see how that perception of COVID-19 has evolved compared to how perceptions of climate change have evolved over a much longer time.
Humans are inherently short-sighted. We have a hard time grasping that far into the future.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, Chris and I were talking a little before the show about how this self-quarantine and just complete lifestyle shift has kind of forced us to not do a lot of the things we were doing before to be more sustainable. I mean, whether it's products you can find in the store or you can't bring your own containers, or like here the recycle center shut down, so I'm hoarding recycling right now. Yeah, the immediate actions of what you can do are definitely affected by real world events. And yeah,
and like climate change, the COVID-19 is having impacts far beyond what you'd imagine. We're still understanding what goes on with it. Like people aren't driving much, so air pollution is way down, and so people aren't going to experience as many deaths from air pollution or from car accidents. This is not the way you want to lower those, but it has that impact. I saw a study recently looking at why car accidents and fatalities on the road declined dramatically a few years ago nationally, and it turned out to be because of the recession. Young people weren't driving as much.
Interesting. Yeah, I was actually going to ask you some of the environmental impacts of this pandemic. I mean, obviously it's not the right reason, like you said, or the right thing that we wanted to be causing it, but we are hearing, there's a lot of, there's less greenhouse gases in the air. There's places where animals are returning and things are kind of starting to flourish. Nature's kind of reclaiming a lot of places, which is an interesting phenomena, but obviously it's not going to last. I just am curious as to your take on all that, or how, significant you think that could be in maybe changing people's views in the future as to getting serious about some of this stuff.
Yeah, I think it'll be, it's interesting to see how this all plays out with respect to people's views of different roles in society. People are saying, the federal government needs to do more, should have done more. A lot of that is true from my perspective, but in the meantime, there's no single obvious correct course of action for policy. So we see different states doing different things, different countries doing different things, and it all involves this challenging trade-off between what how much you reduce the growth of COVID-19 and how much you suppress the strain on hospitals versus how much you reduce the growth in unemployment rate, reduce the expansion of hunger in society, and nobody knows really how to pull out that balance. We don't even have the hard data to figure out how to do that. Yet people are thinking, well, it's obvious we need to do this, we need to do that. Compared to that, the science of climate change is way advanced. We've had economists, scientists working on this for years. We have very concrete ideas of what needs to be done. And I think once we get out of the pandemic mode, people realize we had to make a lot of decisions on the seat of our pants during COVID-19 because we didn't have good data. Climate change, we've got the data. We just need to act on it.
Yeah, I hope that's the case. I mean, we're seeing a big shift in a lot of things, the way people look at the world, and I really hope that they do start to value science more and take the actions that all across the board that need to be taken, both for the pandemic and after. So it's a very good point. Well, I want to talk a little bit about extreme weather, since that's one of your specialties, and I guess just kind of what's causing it and what are some examples. I mean, I know we see these wildfires are getting worse every year. We're getting more Cat 5 hurricanes and other, like floods and droughts, and everything's just seeming to happen more and more. 10-year floods are happening, or 100-year floods are happening every 10 years or less. And it seems like every time we turn around, we're just getting hit with another big thing. So can you kind of explain how some of that might be impacted by climate change and what we can kind of maybe expect for the future, if you have an idea on that?
Yeah, sure. Then let me just paint a broad picture right now. There's two basic types of extreme weather. There's the stuff that is extreme because it's out on the outer ranges of what normally happens, like extreme high temperatures, extreme low temperatures, extreme rainfall, so forth. And then there's things that are extreme weather just because they're weather phenomena, but that automatically are unusual or devastating, like hurricanes, tornadoes, that sort of thing. So climate change is shifting the averages of everything. And so that automatically is going to mean that we'll see more extremes on one end of the scale and fewer extremes on the other. So right now we're about twice as likely to set a high temperature record as we are to set a low temperature record, because that shift has happened. And you might think, well, okay, so that just means the proportions change. We still have the same number of records, but actually, as time goes on, the high temperature records get more and more likely to happen, but you can't get low temperature records below zero frequency. There's a limit to how few you can get. But you could potentially, if you're warming rapidly, you could have a high temperature record every day. So extremes, you become more common just from a shift in the averages. For the other type of extremes, extreme phenomena like tornadoes and hurricanes, it really depends a lot on the particular phenomena as to what's going on with it and how it's affected by climate change. And some things we know are affected a lot, some things may be affected, but we can't tell. Some things we don't have any idea how to be affected. With something like flooding, extreme rainfall is increasing, and we know why. It's because a warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapor, and then when a storm comes, that you have more rain falling at a given time. So that part's easy. But then to get a flood, you need to get the ground saturated if you're talking about a big river system. In a city, any rain that falls is going to run off because the city's got impervious surfaces, and you get flooding increasing in urban areas. In rural areas, it matters also what's happening to the moisture in the soil. If rain falls on dry ground, it's going to soak in for a while. And so moisture is getting depleted because higher temperatures cause more evaporation. So as we start getting these more complicated things happening down the road, it becomes harder to pin down what climate change will actually do. And the statement that everything gets worse is actually a bit of an overstatement. Some things get better, a lot of things will get worse. Some things we still don't figure out, like tornadoes. They're so small that you don't get them in global climate models. And we don't have 50 years of climate type observations. We know about tornadoes because they hit something or because someone went out to look for them. And the things they're hitting are built better than they used to be. And people are going out to look for them much more frequently than they used to. So you can't tell what trends are in that.
Interesting. So I guess we'll kind of shift to talk about, what are some, in your opinion, what are some things that we can do both at a more macro level and maybe as individuals to kind of fight or maybe turn the tide of climate change and hopefully help keep that average temperature lower or from getting higher, in your opinion?
Right. Let's see. It's not sitting around here, and so it's hard for me to recommend the book when I don't remember the author or the name of the book. But it was a really good book. I'll see if I can look up when you're asking a question. But it was written by a guy who is actually an economist in Vancouver, British Columbia, who did a lot of work on the VC cap and trade market and the whole bit. But he made the point that people can do what they want to, and it's really not going to change things until we get policies in place that produce the economic incentives to do things. The bottom line, most important thing people can do is get leaders that see the climate change problems the same way they see them, and to the extent they don't, change public opinion or opinions of politicians to move things more in line. And that means voting, means protests, it means talking to your neighbors, means doing podcasts, it means changing the attitudes of people so that we have a different consensus.
Yeah, that's something that has kind of been repeated, I think, in a lot of our shows and just things that we've read and seen, is that you can make incremental changes individually, but really it comes from the policy and the collective action that governments or groups of people try to make. So.
Yep, and people can collectivize their action. A lot of people doing the same thing has an impact. I'm privileged to have enough income that I can choose what sort of car I purchase, and I purchased an electric car, not because I thought at this point it was going to have a big impact on climate change, because most of our energy profile in Texas comes from coal and natural gas, but more people expanding the market means that you start developing market efficiencies, the cost of production goes down, and then it becomes more economical for more people to buy electric cars. And so trying to accelerate that sort of change by individual action. And that's not political, but it's still doing something with a broader impact on mine rather than just what it's going to do for my own carbon footprint.
Yeah, that's a good point. We're not, we can still do things that make a difference because they also affect the economy and therefore will have a ripple effect, hopefully, down the road.
Yep, we make our choices as to what products we buy and what companies we encourage to make more profits. And there's a lot of companies now that are moving toward a zero carbon footprint and that sort of thing. And I don't know to what extent it's individual investors or mutual funds that are driven by individual investors, but it's not something they would be doing if there wasn't, an impact on their bottom line that was favorable because of it. And I think that's because of the shift in public attitudes that's going on.
Yeah, whatever it takes, man. Whatever gets them to do the right thing, right?
Right.
Chris, did you have any other questions or comments?
I just love listening to you talk. I could listen to. Do you have a TED Talk or something we can listen to after this?
Well, he's probably teaching virtually now. Since
there you go. Yes, and I like how you mentioned we can vote with our dollars too. So it's not just political action we can take, but it's also voting with our dollars in those purchases that we need to make, like a car. We also have to look at getting a second car or change out the one we've got because our children are now teenagers and if the car's too small. So what does that look like? And we are looking at electric because of people who are now more interested in it's a cheaper technology now and there's more stations set up. My husband's got one at his work for an electric car. So voting with your dollars is huge. And that's probably one, if you don't feel comfortable voting or you don't know a lot about, like I only voted for the first time like 4 years ago because I wasn't interested in government, but I was very big on voting with my dollars. So if you feel empowered anyways, definitely you have that power to vote.
Absolutely. And I think I'll add on to that not just the products you buy, but the organizations that are doing some of this work to advance these causes, you can support them with your dollars or with your time or just by, sharing their information, their content. That makes a big difference too in trying to change people's minds and get them to take some collective action. So however you can, make a difference, make phone calls to your elected officials, research things, share things, it all adds up in the end, I think. So
I just thought of some. Sorry. Are you hopeful for a future? Do you see hope? Is it a positive outlook? I'm a natural pessimist, so for me, it's hard not to see it as a bleak future, especially for my kids. But do you see hope?
Yes, I do. The things that worry me the most are the things that I don't know about. We're putting the climate on a track that's outside of not just human experience, but experience of the planet for the past several million years. We're doing it at a time when we've also fragmented ecosystems, and so it's going to be hard for the natural world to catch up on its own. But we have the capacity to help the natural world. Our abilities to accomplish things have been growing rapidly, grown tremendously over the past century. So we'll have the technological ability and financial ability to do things that we wouldn't be able to do today. So even though climate change will have human costs and natural costs, we'll still be very resourceful and still be able to deal with the consequences that I can foresee. And, it's the consequences I can't foresee that I worry about because I can't be as confident about those. But there's nothing that to me says we're screwed.
Okay.
We're stuck with climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of individuals are going to be screwed by climate change because suddenly their house, which used to be outside of the 100-year floodplain, is now in the 100-year floodplain, and that means their home value is now below the equity they have in it, plus they have to pay twice as much for insurance. That's where climate change is impacting individuals. It happens with these boom, 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 here, there, individually, rather than all of society being affected simultaneously like it is with COVID-19. And that makes it harder to see, but it's going to be a real cost. But if we help people through those costs, we really haven't figured out how society is going to help people who are impacted by climate change. If we can do that, we'll be a lot better off.
Okay.
So to piggyback on that, this is a question that Jen, our other cast member who isn't here today, sent in. In what you've seen within your colleagues, or your circle of colleagues, do you think climate scientists have transitioned more from warnings to prevention and prevention to preparedness? Do you think that there's more of an alarmist, well, we're beyond the point of repair and we need to just fix what we're going into? Or do you think there's still some measure of hope that, yeah, we're going to, we can prevent this, we can get through it, and we can do better?
Well, there is anything we do to reduce climate change will reduce the costs. So, like I said earlier, it's not a matter of needing to hit a certain goal or else really bad things happen. Anything we do to reduce the ultimate magnitude of climate change helps. Just like COVID-19, anything we do to reduce the peak number of deaths helps. We can set a target, but that target doesn't mean much. Every single death avoided is a death avoided, and less strain on the healthcare system. And climate change is like that in the sense that most of the impacts we see happening get gradually worse as climate change gets worse. So there's no point at which we should despair, because there's always the opportunity to improve things. In terms of how we do it, I'm a climate scientist, so I don't really know. I can talk about what's been going on. I can talk about why it's happening. I can talk about what possibilities exist as to climate change impacts. But in terms of the appropriate solutions for it, that's outside of my discipline. I can only talk about it as a very interested observer of that aspect of the problem. But I don't know of people working on solutions who've gotten discouraged either.
Well, that's good.
Mm-hmm.
It's encouraging.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, do you have any additional resources that you would suggest for our listeners? Books, podcasts, documentaries, anything you would share with them to learn more about all this?
Well, people hear about the IPCC all the time, but I don't think a lot of people actually try to pick up the 3,000 pages of report that consists of dense scientific ease. But we have things that are called summary for policymakers, which are the most important messages written in language that even a politician can understand. And probably below the average level of the typical listener to this podcast. So I actually encourage people to go ahead and look at, you can download it for free, Summary for Policymakers. There's actually 3 reports that the IPCC comes out with every 7 or 8 years. One is what's going on with the climate system. That's the one I focus on. Then there's one on what are the consequences of that to society, to the natural environment, and so forth. That's working group 2. And then working group 3 is what can be done about it. And it's a tremendous resource. It's very rare that you've got hundreds to thousands of scientists worldwide working on producing the best possible document to serve society. Mm-hmm. And I don't think people take advantage of that resource near enough. They'll be amazed at how deeply people are thinking about the problem and how many opportunities there are for solutions.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And just for those at home, IPCC, that stands for International Panel Climate
Very close.
Commission,
Intergovernmental
something like that.
on climate change.
On climate change, that's right.
IPCC.ch. CH stands for Switzerland for reasons I don't understand.
Okay, IPCC summaries for policymakers. I admit I have not delved into the report myself, but I have read articles on it and summaries, and I know that a lot of folks reference that a lot. So that is a great resource that I'll have to get better at reading. All right, well, I guess at this point we'll kind of transition into our green life hack, and I don't know if that would have been your green life hack, but this is essentially where we talk about something that we can do or that we're doing or we recently discovered to just kind of help us live more sustainably. So Chris, do you have a green life hack today?
I have sort of something. It's not like an actual product or anything like that, but if you don't know, and I know there's some people who don't, if you don't know how to cook or bake, it's a perfect time to learn how to. Learning to feed yourself and just making, even like for me, my stress relief is baker, and so is my daughter. So we've been eating a lot of cookies lately. But if it came down to it, we can cook for ourselves and we can bake for ourselves and we can make bread. We don't have to go out and get it. We can save that product for somebody who doesn't have time, doesn't have the resources to bake for themselves. They can go to the store and pick it up. So yeah, just if you can, if you're interested, just learn how to maybe cook yourself a simple dish or learn how to make bread. It's really easy. It's really not that hard. It's like 5 ingredients, and the oven does most of the work.
Well, that kind of goes along with mine, which was I, for the second year in a row now, have a garden, and I've had a lot more time to devote to it. I was telling Chris earlier, I have spent, pretty much every day at some point in the day, I've been in the garden looking at things, and it's weird because I just will stare at stuff and try to remember what it looked like yesterday and see if it's grown a little centimeter or two. But gardening for me has been a big stress reliever. It's also been a cause of a lot of stress, but if you garden, you understand that because there's always something to fix or plant or figure out the solution to why it's getting eaten up. But it's very rewarding, and I feel more self-sufficient knowing that in a few weeks or months I'll have stuff that I can just go out and grab and eat. So that's my green life hack is, consider starting a garden or even just a plant or two. This is my little victory garden while I'm holed up in self-quarantine and trying to, stay away from folks. But if you don't have the space, there's a lot of great container options. There's a lot of cool hydroponic options now, and you can buy these self-made kits where it comes with everything you need from, the container to the seeds to the dirt and any other fancy thing you want to add. But yeah, just a good old-fashioned garden or plant. That's my green life hack this month. So did you have a green life hack for us, Dr.
Yeah, I do. And it comes back to electric cars, which are, in concept, it's not really a hack. It's an alternative vehicle. But the hack is I'm a really lazy person, and I discovered real quick that you don't have to change the oil on an electric vehicle. You don't have to go to the gas station and fill it up every few days. I just plug it in the garage at night. So suddenly I'm not tied to gas stations, and that was great for me being lazy. And now it's great because I don't have to commune with gas pumps and interact with things other people have touched. I went the full green hack mode yesterday, and up until today, the only reason I needed to take the car to a gas station was to fill the tires up with air. But I actually broke out my bicycle pump yesterday and did it manually. So
Wow.
avoided exposure, green, and got a workout at the same time. It was
It worked.
That's awesome.
That's impressive. What do you drive?
It's a Nissan Leaf.
Okay. Awesome. I hope that my next car can be an EV. I paid mine off last year, and I'm trying to avoid a car payment for as long as I can. So stuck with this one for a little while longer. But if anyone's interested too in a longer discussion on electric vehicles, we had episode 5. We had the evangelist, Buzz Smith on, who's a self-proclaimed, electric car guru. It was a really cool discussion. He's up in Grapevine, I believe, still, and he sells electric cars, and would love to tell you all about them. So,
oh, that was a great episode. My husband was on it, and he's a car nut, and so there's a lot of he's really piqued his interest. Yeah, he was nerding out. It was awesome.
Yeah, well, that's a really cool one, and definitely not one anyone's ever had before, because none of us drive EVs yet. But I'm interested, and I just have to figure out. I hear that the charging situation can be tricky, especially if you're going long distances. So that's where I get a little freaked out. But
we're lucky enough to have 2 cars, so one is
better
around town, and the other one is long distances. And if we get to the point of, it's also when I was going to grad school in the Boston area, a fellow graduate student didn't own a car. He drove a lot, but he would simply rent a car whenever he wanted to go somewhere, and that turned out to be more economical than the expense of owning one.
Yeah. Buzz does mention that in the podcast too, about how it may seem like a lot for an EV up front, but when you take and consider the amount of gas that you have to spend, it actually works itself out, where you could, if you needed to go on that long haul trip, you could just rent a car to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a brand new car every time.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Chris, where can we find you online?
You can find me here, and also at Epically Geeky and Marginally Geeky and Creatively Geeky, the new one, and then on Instagram at The Borough Life.
Awesome. And where can we find you online, or your work? Anything you would like to share, Dr. Nielsen-Gammon?
My students who run the social media outreach are on Facebook and Twitter. Climate Texas, ClimaTexas, and that's also the first part of our website. So presumably Googling Climate Texas will get you everything you need.
Awesome. And you can find me here on Sustainably Geeky and all the other geekies that Chris mentioned. We like a good theme in this channel,
yes,
epically, creatively, and marginally geeky. And on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Het's Gonna Be Me. And you can find the show Sustainably Geeky on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We're also on YouTube and anywhere you subscribe to podcasts. So if you haven't already, please subscribe and give us the thumbs up or the 5-star rating or whatever the qualification is for the channel that you listen on. Share us with your friends and let us know what you want to hear about. Send us a message on social media to kind of, give us some ideas if we haven't already talked about it. Thank you all for listening, and thank you so much for being on, Dr. Nielsen-Gammon. We really appreciate your expertise and you taking the time, especially during this, crazy time of social isolation, of being on the show and just kind of helping us understand some stuff better. So,
well, thanks for reducing some of my social isolation.
Our pleasure. All right. It was great talking to you guys. And for everyone at home, have a great rest of your day.